How many of you have been to Philadelphia to see the Liberty Bell? Great, that's a lot. You know well that it reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof." And these are words that come from this week's Parsha. And since the purpose of this declaration in Torah is meant to signal the release of enslaved people, you might be wondering why the verse says, not all slaves, but lechol yoshveh, all inhabitants. Rabbi Yaakov Yoshua Falk, the 18th century Talmudist known as Pnei Yoshua, also wondered about this. He says it's because in any country where freedom is incomplete, even if this is the case with only some of the people, all of the people are enslaved. I have a fear today that I'd like to share with you. I am afraid for a country that I love. Because even as dozens of our people are being held captive in Gaza, I also believe the entire state of Israel is being held captive to an ascendant and pernicious ideology, which is eating away at the very fabric of Israeli society. There is a growing crack in the Israeli Liberty Bell. The New York Times Magazine this past week details an incident from 1995. It reads, in October of that year, Itamar Ben-Gvir spoke to Israeli television cameras holding up a Cadillac hood ornament, which he boasted had been broken off the Prime Minister's official car during chaotic anti-Oslo demonstrations in front of the Knesset. "We got to his car," he said, "and we'll get to him too." The following month, Rabin was dead. You may recall I shared that same story in a sermon that I gave on November 5th, 2022, on the anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. Ben-Gvir, who used to have a picture of mass murderer Baruch Goldstein in his house, and his partner, Bezalel Smotrich, had just won 14 seats in the Knesset. Smotrich was on his way to becoming finance minister and overseeing the West Bank. Ben-Gvir, desirous of his own private militia to conduct various thuggeries, would be placed in charge of the police. Haaretz ran an editorial that week. It read, "Kahanism won. Israel is now closing in on right-wing religious authoritarian revolution." Above the article was a photo of merchandise, t-shirts and stickers with an image of Mayor Kahana and the Hebrew words, "Kahana Tzadak." Kahana was right. Over the course of the next year, I spoke frequently about the forces of authoritarianism spewing forth from Jewish supremacist circles. I spoke about the battle for Israel's soul. In February of last year, we were in Israel with our next-door neighbors, Tom and Linnell. We visited one of the mass democracy protests. Miriam and I chanted along. Tom interviewed protesters for WYPR. The next week, a masked and violent Jewish mob attacked the Palestinian town of Hawara, burning homes and cars and murdering a 37-year-old man. Smotrich thought it was unfortunate that private Israeli citizens were attempting to wipe out the village. "The village of Hawara should be wiped out," he said, "but I think the state of Israel should do it." Ostensibly, he meant the village, not the people within. The next month, I was in Washington, D.C. with Miriam and Eliyah protesting Smotrich's invitation to the annual Israel Bonds gathering. In fact, it was around this time that I suggested to Emil Bendit that we bring Tal Becker to Beth Am as a scholar and teacher with decades of experience working on behalf of the state of Israel and peace, as an advocate for a two-state solution and for sustaining and advancing democratic norms. Then came Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah. Some say, probably I said, that on October 7th everything changed, but it's not entirely true. On October 7th, we changed. The Jewish people changed. How and to what extent is not yet clear. What did not change was the march of authoritarianism, its increasing illiberal stranglehold on the Jewish state's leadership, rhetoric, and policies. These past 8 months have been immensely difficult, including because life has become more precarious, not only for Israelis, not only for Palestinians in Gaza, but also for Palestinians in the West Bank. And yet, while I've mentioned these things, my concern about the steady rise of something ugly within this country that I love, it's been a while since I've addressed them more fully in a sermon. Part of the reason is that it's hard for many of us, it's hard for me, to set aside the trauma of October 7th. Each week exposes our people's collective wounds to the salt of global public opinion, biased foreign and domestic media, widespread calls for the cleansing of Jews from our historic homeland, cascading anti-Semitism. 2 days before the world saw the massive expose I referenced above, the UN revised down by half its numbers of women and children killed in Gaza. The Times reported it this way: the change came because the United Nations switched to citing a more conservative source for its numbers, the Gazan Ministry of Health, rather than using Gaza's government media office, as it had in recent weeks. Both offices, they write, are part of the Hamas-run government in the enclave. If this leaves you wondering about the true numbers, you're not alone. And this week, the Hostage and Missing Families Forum released bracing new footage of 5 young female soldiers, bloodied and terrified, as they were abducted 8 months ago from Nahal Oz. And 3 more bodies of those slain on October 7th were recovered. Orion Hernandez Rado, Hanan Yablonka, and Michelle Nissenbaum. The remains of Orion's partner, Shani Luke, were retrieved last week. She was the German-Israeli tattoo artist whose partially clothed body was paraded through the streets by Hamas. 128 hostages remain. 39 have been declared dead. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in Pirkei Avot, Al tanachamenu b'sha'a shemeto shemutal lefanav. There is no comfort for those whose dead lie before them. For 8 months, we have been existing in aninut, the purgatoric status of a mourner who has not yet buried his dead. The wound festers. But being in pain, my friends, doesn't absolve us of speaking truth when that truth is evident and we can summon the strength to do so. Sometimes the truth is not clear, and I've tried to avoid definitive claims without evidence and visibility into the situation on the ground. For example, what do we do with a new study currently being peer-reviewed by some of the most respected nutritionists and scientists in Israel, which claim the daily humanitarian aid shipments to Gaza contain 40% higher than the minimum accepted standard for daily caloric intake? How do we square competing claims of responsibility for distributing that aid when Hamas continues its war on Israeli and Palestinian civilians alike? People are starving, no doubt. Is the IDF right, and the problem is Hamas stealing food and supplies for themselves? Some of you might wonder, is there any truth to claims at the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, of Israeli war crimes, as opposed to the tragic reality that too many civilians die in wars? And this is just about the hardest kind of war any nation could be asked to fight. That's why I'm grateful to welcome Tal Becker next Shabbat, because I'm hoping he will be able to shed some sort of light, that he'll be able to help us sort out fact from fiction, truth from propaganda. Nevertheless, while the army may not be deliberately withholding aid as a matter of policy, starving civilians, as Karim Khan claims, it is abundantly clear that bands of extremist Israeli Jews Among them, the so-called hilltop youth are blocking or hijacking many of these aid trucks from Jordan while Ben Gvir's police force takes a knee. And the truth, or at least a preponderance of convincing evidence, I believe, is laid bare by Ronen Bergman and Mark Mazzetti on the glossy pages of the New York Times Magazine. In 3 relentless parts, stretching 14,000 words, the journalists detail 5 decades of policies implemented by left and right-wing Israeli governments, which created space for a messianic movement to claim Jewish sovereignty in occupied land. Despite its epic length, the article is limited in scope. Yes, it skirts various details and missed opportunities by Palestinian leaders and the Palestinian people as well. It ignores real pathways for peace and Palestinian statehood that might have come to fruition but for cowardly or self-serving leaders on both sides of the Green Line. But that, my friends, is also a red herring. I've heard people kvetch about The Wire in this town for years, admiring it as art but castigating its selective storytelling and limited scope. Being incomplete and being wrong are not the same. And this Times piece, heavily researched over many years with informants at the highest levels of military and intelligence communities, it's not wrong. What is the story they tell? That Israel over decades has made it increasingly difficult for a state of Palestine to exist. That there are 2 different legal systems employed in the West Bank, one for Palestinian Arabs that is more severe, one for Israeli Jewish settlers that is more lenient. It is true that there are substantial economic disparities, not just de facto, as a result of discrimination which is real on both sides of the Green Line, but de jure legal discrimination within the Shtachim. That hilltop youth and other occasional violent mobs operate with impunity, that outposts become settlements as so-called facts on the ground, that Israeli incitement like Ben Gvir's, Smotrich's, and Netanyahu's have been effective in eliciting hatred and sometimes violence, both against Palestinians and also against Jews and Jewish leaders who have tried to make peace. And it's also true that some combination of Israeli malice, Israeli complacency, and Israeli fear have fused to embolden the most extreme elements in Israeli society. Make no mistake, the inmates are running the asylum right now. And the very project of a Jewish and democratic state is in peril. We may be in too much pain to fully process that or too stunned to speak about it. Sure, it will take courageous voices from across the Near East and around the world to stop making reductive assertions and engage with pragmatic solutions. But that truth doesn't erase this other truth, that the occupation of the West Bank has been a failure from its earliest stages. And this crack in Israel's Liberty Bell, it is only getting worse. Here's another truth. Our Parsha is concerned not just with the fact of re-entering the land of Israel, but the manner in which we do so. And perhaps the most striking set of obligations are not only about how we are to treat Israelites descended from our patriarchs and matriarchs, but our concern for minority rights, for the ger toshav. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor or unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a resident alien so they can continue to live among you. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the late chief rabbi of the UK, reminds us that not only does the ger toshav have the right to live in the promised land, but they also have the right to share in welfare provisions. Sachs points out that the different areas of halacha place the stranger or that different areas of halacha place the stranger within a set of legal considerations that are about preserving darchei shalom, which essentially means keeping the peace. But that's not the case here in our parsha. Ger Toshav legislation, he writes, is one of the earliest extant forms of minority rights. He brings the Rambam, who says one should act toward resident aliens with the same respect and loving kindness as one would to a fellow Jew. The difference, Sachs explains, between this and later ways of peace legislation is that Darchei Shalom applies to non-Jews with regard to their beliefs or religious practice, or without regard, rather, to their beliefs or religious practice. These concerns date from a time when Jews were a minority in predominantly non-Jewish, non-monotheistic environments. Ways of peace are essentially pragmatic rules of what today we would call good community relations and active citizenship in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. Ger Toshav legislation cuts deeper. It is based not on pragmatism, but on religious principle. According to the Torah, you don't have to be Jewish in a Jewish society and Jewish land to have many of the rights of citizenship. You just have to be moral. Hamas is immoral or amoral. The Palestinian population in Gaza is not the same as Hamas, even as determining the difference has at times been challenging. Palestinians in the West Bank are also not Hamas, and they must, according to our laws, be treated with respect and dignity until such time as they, as the Palestinian people, can achieve the same dignity afforded Israelis these past 76 years. The dignity of being an Am Choshi Ba'artzechem, a free people in a land to which they also have a legitimate claim. Now, to be sure, there is much to be done by Palestinians for Palestinians to achieve that goal. But Israelis, too, must participate fully and consistently in the project of raising up a viable Palestinian state. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, it's an artifact. It will never ring again. But the crack in Israel's Liberty Bell must be repaired because, as Pnei Yehoshua reminds us, any country where freedom is incomplete, all people are enslaved. Or perhaps we should end with another writer and scholar who lived a century later in this country. The same year she penned the New Colossus, in 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote a series of articles titled An Epistle to the Hebrews, in which she coined the phrase, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." Lazarus was concerned that in that essay about Jewish complacency, that comfortable and assimilated American Jews were not sufficiently concerned with the plight of suffering Eastern European Jewry and the repatriation of our fellow people to Eretz Israel. Her words are a good reminder as we round out this year of Am that our people depend on us wherever they are, including in the state of Israel. But another people lives among us in a state we built and for which we bear a substantial measure of responsibility. 2 million of them are citizens of Israel, but 5 million of them are not. Until we are all free, we are none of us free. Our pain, our trauma, must not blind us to the suffering of the Ger Toshav, those not yet citizens who live within our control. Solutions are complicated and elusive. There is no lever to be pulled that will solve this conflict in an instant. But closing our eyes to human suffering and standing idly by while watching some of our brethren create such suffering is not acceptable within a tradition that views each person as sacred manifestations of God's presence. We owe nothing to Hamas. We owe everything to God. And godliness does not know borders or beliefs. It is the stuff that makes us human, that makes us free. Shabbat Shalom.